Welcome to The Murder Book, a true crime podcast, where each week we will present notorious crimes, controversial cases, unsolved cases, missing persons, and serial killers. Details of the crime scenes, childhood of the murderer, and the life of the victims will be explored. Each episode is translated into Spanish. We have a new episode every Monday, and you can listen to it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and other platforms you use to listen to your podcasts. Let's begin. Due to the graphic nature of this episode, listener discretion is advised. Extreme caution for children under 13. Welcome to The Murder Book. I'm your host, Kiara, and we will continue with the story of serial killer Harvey Louis Carrinan, Part 3. Let's begin. From the moment that Mary Miller realized that Kathy had vanished, she had been consumed with a terrible need for haste. It had seemed that if only everyone were mobilized to look for her daughter, Kathy could still be found and rescued. At first, Mary and her family appeared to be the only ones who were passionately concerned about Kathy's disappearance, their whole lives taken up with finding her. Slowly, Mary had come to trust Duane Holman and Billy Buckman, the detectives. She sensed that the search was as important to them as if it were one of their daughters who was lost. She had come to dread weekends and holidays, fearful that the search would be temporarily abandoned. But then she saw that Holman and Buckman kept right the working regardless of the day. Mary talked to them by phone each day, sometimes several times a day. One thought burned inside Mary. Harvey Carrinan knew what had happened to Kathy. He had admitted coming to Sears, where Kathy had waited, but Mary was sure he lied when he said he had never seen her. His refusal to take a lie detector test only clinched her suspicions about him. Why can't you just go in and search in his house and his garage and his cars? And this was a question that she would ask the detectives for what seemed like the 100th time. And Buckman would explain patiently, the prosecutor says we don't have enough probable cause. We have no physical evidence. We don't even have one witness who actually saw him with Kathy. And Mary started crying. Then shake it out of him, force him to talk. And then Detective Billy Buckman would answer and say, we can't do that. In the old days, well, things were different then. Not now. He has his constitutional rights. We can't violate them, or anything we got out of him would be excluded. We couldn't use it in court anyway. And then Mary would ask, what about Kathy's constitutional rights? Duane Hoffman looked at the floor and then said painfully, under our present system, I'm afraid the victim doesn't have the constitutional rights that the suspect has. And this seemed incomprehensible to Mary. And yet, when she called the prosecutor's office herself, she was given essentially the same information. Victims' rights were nowhere near as clearly defined as those of suspects. Since no one knew what had happened to Kathy, whether she was alive or dead, Kathy had no rights. So another weekend came. It was Saturday, June 2nd, 1 month to the day since Kathy had walked away into a kind of endless twilight. Strangely, Mary had begun to feel a lessening of tension. If not peace, the beginning of acceptance. She knew that Cassie was never coming home. Perhaps it was the fact that it had been exactly a month since Kathy had vanished. Perhaps it was something more ephemeral. Mary talked that morning with Bachman and Holman, and they too could sense a calmness, the dull acknowledgement of what must be. The next day, they found Kathy. On that Sunday morning, two 16-year-old boys were riding their motorbikes along the narrow roads that crisscrossed the Tulalip Indian Reservation north of Everett. They stopped to pick salmon berries growing in the brush just off the Waterworks Road, and were pushing their way into the dense vegetation just before noon, when they suddenly caught a trace of alien odor on the wind. It was the sicky sweet smell of death. One of the boys walked farther into the brush, and he saw a figure there, something or someone wrapped in a shroud of black plastic sheeting. The youth shouted to his friends, "Come back in here, see if it looks to you like it looks to me." And it did. The wrapped figure seemed surely to be a body, and the boys did not attempt to investigate further. They rode on their motorbikes to the Tulalip tribal office 2 miles away. There they called the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and were instructed to return to the intersection of the Tulalip Road and Waterworks Road to await the arrival of deputies and lead them in. Deputy K. Engelbretson in Unit 36 arrived at the site at 1:15 p.m., followed within minutes by Patrol Sergeant Alan Halliday. The deputies recognized the witnesses. John Biggin, 16, was a nephew of the chief of police of the hamlet of Arlington, Washington, and Halliday and Engelbretson walked into the woods about 15 feet and saw a log that blocked the narrow rough trail. Beyond the log, the officers could see the outlines of a human form beneath the black plastic. On closer perusal, they could see that the body was nude. It had lain in this sylvan bowl for a long time, so long that the deputies could not determine if the corpse was that of a male or female, or how death might have occurred. Halliday activated his portable radio and called for assistance from Detective Sergeant Tom Hart and the coroner's office. None of the investigators from Snohomish County realized yet the magnitude of their discovery. They have no idea whose body they had found. The victim might have been left there after a family dispute had exploded into violence, or after some drunken melee in a tavern. Identification would have to wait. Whatever had happened to the victim had happened a long time before, possibly months before. There was no need to hurry now. The important thing was to be sure the scene was thoroughly searched for any clues that might have been left behind the killer or killers. The scene itself was deceptively peaceful as the officers talked in hushed tones. Daisies dotted the bright green grass, and wild roses grew in tangled clusters. The only sounds beyond their own voices came from birds and the whisper of wind through the trees. The figure of the victim lay on its side, one hand tucked beneath the chin, as if he or she had only lain down in the woods for a nap. Detective Hart went over the area with a metal detector in an effort to locate a possible murder weapon or some other small clues that might lie hidden beneath the undergrowth. He came up with a few beer bottle caps, long rusted, but nothing of value. Beyond the body side, there was a kind of bootleg dump where old car parts and debris had been thrown away, and the region had obviously been used as a lover's lane. It was isolated enough to attract those who wanted privacy, more than a quarter of a mile from the nearest home. Coroner Laurie Hudson examined the body at the scene and determined that death had undoubtedly occurred at least a month before. There were 2 nickel-sized holes apparent in the right rear of the skull, and there was a large area of crushing to the skull on the left side just behind the ear. That's evidence of trauma from a heavy weapon. The victim had excellent teeth, and they had been carefully cared for with dental work. The hair was light brown or blonde and longish, but in the era of long-haired males, this would not be positive proof of sex. The fingernails were small and well kept, possibly those of a woman who cared for her appearance. And Hart said, well, it didn't happen here. There are no clothes here at all. I think the murder took place somewhere else, and then the victim was wrapped in plastic and brought here. Soil and vegetation samples were taken and bagged for the crime lab. The victim's hands, too, were encased in plastic, secured with rubber bands at the wrist to protect the fingertips for possible print identification. At 3 p.m., the body was removed and taken to Everett to await autopsy. The Snohomish County detectives cleared the body site then and ran out along the Waterworks Road to canvass nearby residents. The woman who lived in the nearest house said she had not seen or heard anything unusual for weeks. She thought the Woods property belonged to a man who lived in a trailer at the far end of the Waterworks Road. But when the man himself was contacted, he said he had no idea how the body had come to be on his acreage. A check of missing persons reported in Snohomish County netted no possibles. Sergeant Hart stopped by the Everett Police Department and obtained their list of currently missing persons. They had no one who might have matched the victim found on the reservation. And then he called the Seattle Police Department. When he described the victim as having been 5 feet 7 or 8 with blonde hair, his call was transferred at once to Dwayne Holman and Billy Bowman. The detective team had expected that the call would come one day, and still it was a shock. And Harvey Carrinan had been followed over the mountains to the Canadian border, over the Seattle area, and now it seemed that Kathy's body had been left on the Tulalip Reservation, such a short distance from where they have questioned Harvey's friend, Mrs. Sylvester. In a way, it figured the Indian Reservation was not very far from the plywood firm where Kathy's books had been left. But when they had questioned Kathy Sylvester, they had been convinced that she knew nothing about Kathy Miller. The woman had appeared only to be a platonic friend of Harvey's, an older woman, and surprised and concerned when they approached her. Before they called Mary Miller, they wanted to be sure. They did not want to put her through the agony of thinking that this body was her daughter's, not until they were positive that it was. Holman and Buckman had Kathy's dental charts. Mary had seen that both of her children always had dental care. Now these charts might serve a more tragic purpose. On June 4th, pathology Dr. Emmanuel Bitar tentatively identified the body found on the Tulalip property as Kathy Miller after comparing the victim's teeth with the dental chart. First, permanent molars, right and left, silver fillings on biting surfaces. In addition, one small silver filling on the left, first permanent molar, outside surface. This outside filling is indicated on dental chart of Catherine Sue Miller. An unusual filling, this last entry, and almost absolute proof that it was indeed Kathy, who had lain so long in the lonely woods, and all of the searching would not have saved her. At 8 a.m. that Monday, the autopsy began with Holman and Buckman in attendance along with the Snohomish County detectives. Kathy had sustained tremendous blows to the head from a heavy blunt instrument. The cheekbone, the lateral orbit of the left eye, was fractured. There were smaller areas of damage on the right side, the nickel-sized holes seen by Coroner Hudson. So Buckman asked him, what weapon? And the doctor said, well, this would be consistent with a 2x4. or a hammer, possibly a tire iron. There are at least 3 blows, maybe 4. A blunt instrument swung repeatedly. And then some small comfort for those who had loved Kathy. She would have been unconscious with the first blow and dead within moments. She would not have time to be frightened or to feel pain. The perpetrator of such crime, Holman and Bowman, pondered that they each visualized and immersed a strong man in the grip of a homicidal rage. Neither would allow himself to think of the pictures of the shyly smiling young girl who had been Kathy Miller. They would have to tell Mary Miller now that Kathy was dead, and they dreaded it as much as anything they had ever had to do, perhaps delaying as they wished they could do forever. The 2 detectives drove to the body site on the Tulalip Reservation before they returned to Seattle. They could see where a vehicle had been parked with its motor running. The grass and soil still bore the discoloration from exhaust burns. The driver had not tarried long, only stopped his vehicle long enough to rid of its incriminated burden. Whoever had left Kathy here, he had been shrewd, fully aware of the dangerousness of physical evidence. The body had been carefully swaddled in the black visqueen so that no blood could mark the killer's vehicle, and the victim's clothing had been thrown away someplace else. Kathy's books had been dumped a few miles away in the plywood firm's parking lot, and the murderer had not intended to leave even minuscule signs that might lead back to him. Duane Holman and Billy Buckman drove to the Pugliese house where Mary Miller waited for them. The discovery of the unidentified body had somehow been leaked to the media, and Mary had heard it. She led the detectives in and offered them a seat without asking why they had come. She knew why, and she could not change it. But she needed time, some way to delay what they would tell her. And Duane Holman began and said, "Mrs. Miller, Mary, the dental charts from your dentist, there was a perfect match with a body found north of Everett. We have been up there today, Mary. It's Kathy." She asked, "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" They say yes. Mary's eyes were filled with tears, but she did not cry. She stared back at them quite calmly, trying to find words. It was typical of Mary Miller that even as she dealt with the news, she was concerned about the detective's feelings. She said, "I have conditioned myself to this for the last 30 days, but it doesn't make it easier. Thank you for finding my daughter." And Billy Buckman said, "The case isn't finished. We will continue to work on it until we find a way, as long as it takes, as long as we're policemen." As he spoke, none of them could know just how long it was going to take, or how much horror still lay ahead. To the layman, it would seem that now murder charges would certainly be filed against Harvey Carrinan. The body of the victim had been found. Kathy Miller was no longer only a missing person. Kathy was dead, murdered by someone who had taken her from a busy commercial intersection to some killing place, and then to the lonely isolation of the Tulalip Reservation. Holman and Buckman drove from the corner in front of the Sears store to the body site and noted that it was 42 miles one way. The round-trip driving time would have taken 70 to 80 minutes. The trail where the body was left was 1.2 miles from the home of Carrinan's friend Kathy Sylvester. Harvey himself was reported to have once owned property in the Tulalip Reservation and often drove there to visit Mrs. Sylvester. Yes, It would seem that murder charges were imminent, but the legal processes were hampered by the complete lack of physical evidence. And now, detectives Dwayne Holman and Billy Buckman increased the pace of the investigation. They were concerned that Harvey Carrinan might bolt and run at any time and leave the jurisdiction, that he might even leave the country. He had little to keep in the Seattle area and much to avoid. His employees at the Southmore noticed that Harry was getting antsy. He pulled at his face constantly and so ferociously, it looked as if he was trying to put it off. His twitching was as bad as they have ever seen it, and he perspired so much that he was forever wiping his forehead with his handkerchief. Everything seemed to irritate Harvey, and he actually frightened the men who worked for him with his temper when his temper exploded. One of Harvey's employees warned Holman, the detective, and he said, "You have never seen anyone get mad the way Harvey does. I have seen him so angry that he picked the whole front end of his truck off the ground and slammed it down. If you going to take him, you better get the first blow in, or it would be rough to subdue him. Don't ever let him get a hold of you. He won't let up until he crushes you." Alice Carrinan had left Harvey apparently for good, and he seemed to have little enthusiasm for his business. Harvey did have family in the area, his mother, stepfather, who lived in West Seattle, but he had family in the Minneapolis area too, and the detective team assumed that Minnesota must beckon to their suspect seductively. And yet Harvey was tenacious when it came to clinging to the women who belonged to him. He seemed compelled to badger them until they returned to him. Whatever Sheila Carrinan was, his first wife had apparently found it necessary to go underground to avoid him. Alice Carrinan was still moving from place to place so that she would not have to confront him. Harvey, as anxious as he was to get out of town, would not leave until he talked to Alice. He had always been able to convince Alice that the sky was green if he wanted to, and he still thought he could. He spent a lot of time thinking about his situation. Certain things had not gone as he had planned them. The friends who had been sure would alibi for him had reneged. Candy Erling had apparently spilled her stupid little guts to the police, painting him as a seducer of young girls. And Alice had asked too many questions when he had decided to throw away his boots, nagging at him and reminding him he would have the boots for only 3 months. His brother-in-law had to stick his nose into things too. They were all breathing down his neck and getting in his way, but the worst of all were the cops. He hated Dwayne Holman and Billy Buckman most of all. They seemed always to be sneaking around, checking on him, asking questions. He made it a point of looking over his shoulder now wherever he went to see who was following him. He wasn't sure if the cars behind him were police sneakers, but he heard the rotors of the pig's helicopter overhead. And there was no question about it. His constitutional rights were being violated and somehow was going to pay for that. And he studied enough when he was inside the joint, and he knew the law, and he knew that they didn't have anything on him. Nothing. At this point, Dwayne Hoffman and Billy Buckman would have had to agree with Harvey. They didn't have anything concrete. The one piece of physical evidence was the black plastic that had been found with the body. Visqueen. It's a common product used by builders to keep house foundations dry. It's what we call Tyvek, right? It's similar to the Tyvek. Used by landscapers also to keep weeds from growing under beauty bark. So it's that black plastic that they put down in the landscaping jobs. And it was used by Harvey Carrinan to wrap gasoline pumps that were not currently in service. They managed to find a sample of the black plastic used in the Salmore pumps. A partial roll of is still rested in the attic of the garage of the home Harvey had shared with Alice, but technicians at the police crime lab found that it was not from the same lot as the skin wrapped around Kathy Miller's body. They had been sure that it would match, and the news from the lab was a bitter disappointment, just as the analysis of the contents of the vacuum cleaner bag had been. There still was no physical evidence. The button Alice had found the weekend after Kathy's disappearance was lost forever, and none of Kathy's clothing had been found despite a concentrated search of the Tulalip Reservation. The clothes that Harvey had worn on May 2nd and 3rd had been washed many times and would be useless for examination for bloodstains. There were the school books found at the plywood mill, if only Harvey's prints or even a small section of a print that tied in with his could be found on the pages of those abandoned books. That would be enough to show that he had been with Kathy, but the timekeeper had wiped those books off because they were wet with rain. ID technician Carsey Jespen worked for days over the algebra book. Using the Nihedrin process, he was able to isolate portions of 2 fingerprints from a sheet of notebook paper tucked between the textbook pages, an assignment dated April 30th, 1973, and marked A+, B+. The prints had come from the left index and left middle finger of the person who had touched the page. However, when Jepsen compared the prints to those on file for Harvey Karanen, they did not match. The Nihedrin process for developing Latin prints on paper, it's a miraculous thing. Prints left a half century earlier can be lifted from paper with this procedure, but the prints on Kathy's assignment seem worthless for evidentiary use. Now that Kathy's body had been found, Jepsen worked to obtain her fingerprints. The fact that most teenagers had never been fingerprinted is often a roadblock in police investigations. They had never been in the armed services, had never applied for jobs that require security clearance and fingerprinting. So when young bodies are found, there may not be a positive way to identify them. Because Kathy's body had lain exposed to the elements for a month, her fingertips were dry and shriveled from the sun and would not give good prints. Jepsen soaked her hands and fingers in a 3% solution of sodium hydroxide to soften them, and then apply a 3% solution of formaldehyde until the top layer sloughed off and the ridges beneath appeared. Photographs and impressions were taken, and Jepsen was finally able to isolate a usable set of prints. Comparing these prints to the algebra paper, he found what he had expected. The prints on the school papers were Kathy's. It seemed as if the fates themselves were conspiring with the suspect to hide all traces of evidence that might connect him solidly with the murder of Kathy Miller. There were witnesses to somewhat suspicious behavior on Harvey's part, and now some of them came forward tentatively to report their feelings. Rod Sloan had reported the alibi attempt, the transparent lie, and the ex-cons that Harvey had had to kill. And now another man recalled being in the Karanen home a week or so after Kathy vanished. He says, "I said to Harvey and Alice that the girl was probably a runaway and would turn up any time, and Harvey, he says, I'll kiss your ass if she turns up alive." On June 14, a call came into headquarters that looked like the break that Holman and Bachman had sought for so long. A man called and said, "I gave Harvey Karanen some black visqueen. I have the other end of the roll." The detective answering the phone asked for the man's name, but he refused to identify himself. He did, however, promise to call at 3:45 when Holman and Buckman came on duty to work the night shift. The informant did call back, and he turned over the remainder of the roll of black plastic. In the laboratory, the detectives held their breaths as the fresh roll was placed next to the skin taken from the body and the edges approximated. The tears did not match. And Buckman said bitterly, "Well, he must have torn it again before he used it. Where's that piece? Where's the piece that matches?" And Detective Holman said, "Gone. Gone like everything else." They had yet to get a go-ahead on a search warrant for Harvey's purple Tornado, although they doubted that it would be of much help now to process the car. Harvey had had 6 weeks to wash and vacuum it. So Holman said flatly, "Well, we're going to lose him. He's going to get in that car one of these days soon, and he will be gone. And there's not a damn thing we can do to stop him. We don't even have a traffic warrant on him. Right now, today, we would be lucky to arrest him for jaywalking." He knocked Alice around. She could charge him with assault, but she wouldn't. She's afraid of him one minute, the next minute she's thinking about reconciling with him. Either way, I don't think that she's liable to file assault charges against him. So this is what the detectives are doing back and forth. Harvey Kavanaugh's customers were dwindling. His picture had appeared in the papers under headlines about Kathy Miller's murder. An employee called Holman and Buckman and reported that a customer had asked Harvey point blank if he had killed Kathy. And the employee said, "Harvey started sweating and pulling on his face like he does, and he told the guy not to say such things. I thought you guys were picking on him, but now I'm beginning to worry about my own daughters." Harvey gets turned on by 14 to 18-year-old girls, and he doesn't care how crude he is when he talks to them or who's around when he says it. And I might as well tell you, Harvey's really saying goodbye to people now. He's heading out. And Buckman asked, "When?" And the employee said, "I'm not sure." And then there was a long silence on the line. And then he says, "There's something else I better tell you for your own protection. Harvey showed me this hammer, this new ball-peen hammer. He holds it out and he smiles and he said, what did he say?" He says, "This hammer is to take care of Holman and Buckman. He wants to crush your heads before he leaves." Billy Buckman and Dwayne Holman took the threat seriously. They had little doubt that Harvey would relish killing them. Nevertheless, they were determined to search his vehicles before he left Seattle. At long last, the detective team's pleas to the prosecutor that a search warrant for the Tornado was essential were successful. One loophole in the Fourth Amendment, which protects the citizen from unreasonable searches and seizures can be utilized when the item to be searched is a vehicle. Because a vehicle can be quickly moved out of the locality or jurisdiction in which the warrant is sought, cars known to be on their way out of state can be searched. While Holman and Buckman waited for word that the search warrant had been signed by a judge, members of the tax squad observed Harvey in front of his mother's house in West Seattle on June 19th at 6:35 in the evening. He was moving some of his possessions into his mother's house, apparently storing his things there in preparation for a trip. If the warrant did not arrive before Harvey left, they would be helpless to stop him. Shortly before 7, the warrant signed by Judge Quigley was delivered to Holman and Bachman, and they sped toward West Seattle. At the hand signal, a tow truck backed into place in front of the purple Tornado, parked there, and hooked onto its bumper. At that moment, Harvey drove up. He saw the tow truck, and he bailed out of his pickup and walked furiously up to the Oldsmobile. Then he spotted Dwayne Holman standing there. Holman had never seen the suspect so angry, and Harvey reached back into the truck. Holman expected to see the new ball-peen hammer in his hand. Billy Buckman unloosed his service revolver from his holster, prepared to protect his partner. And Harvey spotted Buckman and brought his hands out, empty, but he was still mad as hell. And Harvey pulled at his face unconsciously and he started protesting and saying, "What's going on here? What do you think you're doing?" And Holman said, "Well, we have a search warrant for your Tornado. Would you like to read it?" And Harvey glanced at it with a half smile, half sneer, and the tension of the moment passed. And he said, "You could have searched my car anytime. I don't need to see a warrant." And Hoffman asked, "Are you planning to leave Seattle, Harvey?" He said, "I'm going to Denver to look for a job." And so they asked him, "How long do you think you'll be gone?" 6 to 8 days. The tow truck began to pull its burden away from the curb, and Holman turned to Harvey and said, "We'll be seeing you." Harvey Carrinan stared back at the man who had dogged his trail and attempted a look of bravado. But he couldn't manage it. The beads of sweat broke free from his forehead and coursed down his face. In the Seattle police garage, the Tornado awaited the ministrations of Giambattista and Don McLaren lab criminalist. It was photographed, vacuumed, and any latent prints were lifted from it. It was dirty, full of junk, an empty pint of whiskey under the back seat, a scattering for some reason, or of plastic baby blocks, hamburger wrappings, an amphetamine pill, a few seeds that appeared to be marijuana. But there were no long blonde hairs, no buttons, no torn scraps of blue and white fabric, no school books or papers, nothing of Kathy Miller. Batista found that all the windows had been wiped down inside and out, almost all. The outside of the passenger window had been wiped clean, but not the inside. From the surface, Miss Batista lifted a print. She lifted a partial paw print. And it could have been the missing link. The one vital shred of evidence that would have stopped Harvey Carrinan. The print was compared to Harvey Carrinan's palm prints, to Alice Carrinan's palm prints, and it matched neither. It had come from a smallish hand, a woman's hand, certainly, but tragically, ID technician Jespen had been unable to retrieve Kathy Miller's palm print. Only her fingerprints and there were no fingerprints on the window that Harvey had overlooked, so only the palm print. No one would ever be able to say absolutely that it was Kathy Miller's hand that had pressed against that window, perhaps in a vain attempt to escape. There has never been a doubt in Dwayne Holman's or Billy Buckman's mind that the partial palm print on the passenger window of Harvey Carrinan's purple Tornado was left by Kathy Sue Miller. Had her bludgeoned body had been found soon enough, They could have had a print to compare. Fate and time had robbed the investigators of that vital clue, but the discovery indicated to them that Harvey was far from infallible. He thought he had erased all evidence from the Oldsmobile. Indeed, he had been nervous as he watched the car being towed away for processing, perhaps apprehensive that there still might be something left in the Tornado that could harm him. The overlooked palm print showed that Harvey had been a little careless. If he had made one mistake, he would have made another and another. It was only a matter of time. But the passage of time alarmed the two detectives. They were convinced that Harvey had killed not only Kathy Miller, but also Laura Leslie Brock. Perhaps there were other bodies lying undisclosed in a desolate area. The manner of murder and the randomness of it could bode nothing but tragedy ahead. The roving random killer never stops until he's apprehended. Their own powerlessness to stop him gaffed actually galled them. Harvey had hit the road again, driving his silver canopy pickup truck, and abandoned his suspect Oldsmobile. The two detectives dreaded the possibility of future victims. They did not drop the probe simply because they suspected Harvey had run back to Minnesota, back to his old stomping grounds. They knew that he was obsessed with Alice and that he would be unable to stay away from her for very long. She had rejected him, and Harvey wouldn't allow that to continue. He would be back. Detectives Holman and Bogman talked with Harvey's mother and stepfather. They found his parents very protective of the son who had given them nothing but trouble from the time he was a child. His mother was reluctant to say anything that might connect her son to Kathy's murder, but the detectives could see the indecision in her eyes. She was not as positive of Harvey's innocence as she proclaimed. She said painfully, "I'll have to agree that Harvey isn't telling the complete truth." She tensed as they spell out the circumstantial evidence linking Harvey to the brutal murder of a 15-year-old schoolgirl, and she seemed relieved when they switched the line of questioning to the whereabouts of Harvey's first wife, Sheila. Sheila had vanished so completely that the detectives had begun to wonder if she might be the corpse discovered in British Columbia. Canadian Sergeant U.K. Butner had shown great interest when Holman and Bachman laid out their case to him. So much interest, in fact, that he had made a trip to Seattle to compare notes with them. He said, "Our body was that of a woman believed to be in her mid-30s to early 40s, about the age of Sheila Carrinan. We don't have the whole body, only the torso. She was wrapped in this blanket," and he held a Polaroid picture of a weathered, stained blanket with an unusual pattern. And he said, "We can't even be sure of the cause of death, but somebody dumped that torso in the ditch. Our feeling is that the victim may have been brought up from the States. We have publicized the body discovery all over Canada, and no one's come forth with a positive identification, not even close. All we really know is that she was Caucasian, medium weight, medium height, and that she had been born at least one child." And Bachman asked, "She was found in May of this year, 1973, right?" And Butner nodded. He said, "But our pathologist estimates that she had been dead since November last year." And Hoffman said, "Well, that would fit. Harvey made trips up to British Columbia often. His wife, his current wife, went with him usually, but she always says that he often left her alone for hours at a time, and she doesn't know where he went. He has an uncle up there that they had visited. But now that as Butner joined the Seattle detectives and questioning Harvey's mother, she shook her head and she said, Sheila's all right. At least she was the last I heard. I think I have her last address. And she looked through an address book and nodded. And she said, here, she's married again. Her name's Cooper or Hooper or something like that. And after working through a series of forwarding addresses, the investigators found Sheila Carrinan Cooper, and she was alive and well. But she was very nervous. She was working as a part-time grocery clerk, and she begged the detectives not to reveal where she worked or where she lived. She said, I can't talk to you. And Detective Bowman urged and said, you might have something to tell us that could be very important. And she said, let me think about it. I'll call you. And Sheila did eventually talk to Holman and Bachman. And so they asked him, well, tell us about what you can about Harvey Carrinan. So she said, well, I was married to him. I married him in 1969. I divorced him in 1971. We were only married a short time when he was picked up for burglary and for carrying a gun. They dropped the burglary charges later, but they sent him back to prison for violating his parole. And Sheila, at this point, she voiced her fear of her ex-husband. She said, at the end of our marriage, I knew he was about to do something to me, hurt me. He had a temper that you couldn't believe. I know I escaped because I managed to keep calm and I talked to him quietly. But the thing about Harvey is he hates women. He hates women with a passion. And the room was quiet. The detectives were going to leave. They stand out to leave. Sheila looked up and asked, can you tell me something about the little girl, the Miller girl? How was she killed? And the detectives explained the case to Harvey's first wife, and she nodded. She said, I have no doubt at all that he killed her. He's a very, very intelligent man. He keeps exact records about everything he does, either written or in his head. He's very methodical, but his temper, his rage. And she sort of shuddered, remembering. So the detectives assured that her ex-husband was presently missing from the Seattle area, and she seemed relieved. Alice Carrinan, however, remained ambivalent. She had moved back into her house and started divorce proceedings, but somehow Harvey's bad points had begun to fade now and that he was so far away. And he wrote to her often, almost every day, and his letters were so full of love and tenderness. She was not ready to take him back, but she couldn't really tell him that there wasn't any hope either, not when she read the pages and pages of love thoughts he poured out to her. She did let detectives Holman and Bachman know that Harvey was in Minneapolis living with relatives, but more than that notification she was not prepared to give. Dwayne Holman and Billy Bachman had no ambivalence at all. They prepared a dossier on Harvey Carrinan, summaries of the murders of Laura Brock and Kathy Miller, and sent it to the Minneapolis Police Department, warning Minnesota police that Harvey was now in their bailiwick, or the bailiwick. The information was noted and filed away. At the moment, the Minnesota Authority had no cases whose MO resembled the crimes Harvey was suspected of on the West Coast. The Minnesota police couldn't follow Harvey around waiting for him to do something. After a while, nobody remembered the packet of information sent from Seattle. not even the clerk who had filed them away. Although Harvey Kavanaugh was now living more than 2,000 miles away, the detectives, Holman and Buckman, did not forget about him. The thick case files that held all the paperwork on Kathy Miller's murder still rested on their desks, and the two men looked through them often, seeking the one route that they might not yet had explored. Harvey Kavanaugh had told detectives Holman and Buckman that he was heading for Colorado the last time they have seen him. Whether he intended to go to Denver at the time or whether he was merely trying to throw them off his trail is not known. What is known is that he did not turn his pickup truck to the east. Instead, he headed south into California. He undoubtedly drove all night on June 19, 1973, because the next day found him in Solano County. Harvey was cited for speeding in that California county on June 20th. Although he delighted in using the freeways here and then, there and then, someplace else as a means of being hundreds of miles away, he invariably left a trail with his traffic tickets. The California ticket would one day be of great interest to Detective Sergeant Erwin Karlstedt of Sonoma County. Karlstedt was dealing with a rash of murders of young women in his jurisdiction in the early 70s. Between February 1972 and December 1973, 6 women were found murdered in the Santa Rosa area of Sonoma County, which adjoins Solano County, where Harvey was pulled over for speeding. All of the young women were nude, and no clothing or personal possessions were found near their bodies. And between May and July of 1973, 4 more naked female bodies were found in the San Francisco, south of the Sonoma-Solano area. Still another young woman's corpse was found off Interstate 5 near Redding, California in July 1973. Even today, 10 years later, there is no way to tie Harvey in with any of those killings. In common with the victims attributed to Harvey, none of them had been strangled. One had succumbed to a tremendous blow in the back of the head, and 7 of the 11 had been raped. Of the 11, 1 was totally out of the pattern suspected in Harvey's MO. She had been poisoned. Whatever his activities may have been in Northern California, Harvey did not stay in that state long. He soon had traveled cross country to his former home, Minnesota, and a half-brother living in Minneapolis took him into his home. On June 28th, a Minneapolis woman, Marlis Townsend, waited for a bus on a deserted street corner. Suddenly, there was someone behind her. The sound of the scrape of a boot or shoe sliding across the sidewalk. Heavy breathing. But before she could turn around, something slammed her into the back of her head and she found conscious. When she came to, she found that she was in a pickup truck, a truck driven by a huge balding man. Still foggy and in pain, she was horrified when the man grabbed her hand and attempted to place it on his genitals. And he barked, "Touch me." And she pulled away and grabbed frantically for the door handle next to her. The man saw what she was doing and swore at her, seizing her hair in his hand to stop her from tumbling out. What he did not know was that she was wearing a wig. She pulled free of his grasp, leaving her wig behind, still clenched in her startled attacker's hand. When she hit the pavement, she got up and started to run, literally saved by a hair. The truck had been a General Motors product, she thought, with a silver camper on top of it. The man, probably in his late 40s, was with graying brown hair, was what there was of it, and he had worn work clothes. She considered that she had probably escaped death, and perhaps she had. Still full of rage, living without a woman in Minneapolis, Harvey blamed the breakup of his marriage, the loss of his the loss of his business, and his tenuous financial situation on the detectives, Holman and Buckman. He was tremendously bitter, and he mourned over the memories of life with Alice, as she had indeed been the one great love of his life. He wrote to her constantly, long, literate letters written in an astonishingly fine hand. The letters were addressed to Alice at their former home, where she now felt safe to inhabit. She also had her children living with her again. She was attempting to rebuild her life without Harry, or Harvey, I should say. Also, in Seattle, Mary Miller was trying to cope with the tragic changes in her life. The house that had been full of people yawned emptily now. Illness and age had claimed her grandmother and great-aunt, and Kathy was gone forever. When Kathy's grandparents developed a roll of film that had been in their camera for a long time, they found that one frame had been of Kathy, a picture that no one remembered taking. Kathy gazed solemnly into the camera's lens, an almost invisible aura of light around her head. She held her white dog cuddled in her arms. Mary had the picture enlarged and placed it on a shelf next to the fireplace. This last picture of her beautiful, perfect daughter, who would never be older than 15. Mary tried to explain to her parents that the law was different in America, that the legal procedures they had mastered so long ago in Latvia had no weight in the United States. In Europe, a suspect is guilty until proven innocent. In America, it is just the opposite. The poor Galicies shook their heads, unable to understand how Harvey Carignan was free to walk the streets when it seemed so likely that he had destroyed Kathy. Mary herself had difficulty understanding. And she asked Detective Holman, can he be extradited back from Minnesota? Can he just run away like this? And Holman explained to her, we couldn't arrest him even if he comes back here. We certainly had no legal way to go after him in Minnesota. We have written to warn the police in Minneapolis. That's all we can do. Mary knew Holman and Bogman well enough now to see that the weight of the problem lay heavy on them too. She trusted them and knew they shared her pain. Kenny Miller found the loss of Kathy unbearable. He simply would not accept that Kathy was dead, murdered. He told his friends that Kathy had decided to get married and that she had moved after her wedding to another state. Privately, to Mary, he said that he knew someone had killed Kathy, but that he couldn't say that out loud to his friends. She let his pathetic lies go. One day he would have to accept the truth, but if it helped him now to make up a story, so be it. Kenny began to drag people home, other youngsters who seemed to have no place to go, even people he met on the street who appeared to need a warm meal and a place to sleep. And Mary recalled that the following. She says, I finally realized what he was trying to do. The house had been so full, and now it was so empty. He was trying to fill it up again. I had to tell him that we were not the Union Gospel Mission, that no matter how many people he brought home, it would never be the same as it was. Mary subscribed to 2 Minneapolis papers, determined to keep track of Harvey's Carignan's whereabouts. Whenever the detectives heard anything, they reported it to her. But there was so little. Harvey was working in Minnesota. They didn't know if he would ever be back. One thing, and this is what Detective Billy Bowman told Mrs. Miller in the fall of 1973. He says, if Harvey should come back, we have a charge, not murder, but third-degree assault. His wife has finally agreed to file charges over a beating he gave her before she left him. If he shows up in Seattle, we can arrest him on that. But third-degree assault isn't enough to warrant extradition back here. So Mary asked, and how long could you hold him? And they said, not long. Unless the parole board should decide to violate him on that charge, That's not likely since he was on the inactive parole. Mary Miller plunged into volunteer work to help other victims' families. She had been active even before Kathy's disappearance in working for the rights of privacy regarding the sexual history of rape victims in courtroom testimony. Mary Miller was, as is, a mover, a shaker, ready to speak out when she sees iniquities in the law. As the daughter of two judges, perhaps that was to be expected. She had learned from her own experiences that there was nowhere bereaved families of crime victims could go for comfort and support. More than that, she vowed that the system had to be changed. The parole board had to assess early release of violent prisoners more carefully. They have to have all the information that was available on those prisoners' backgrounds when they made decisions that might well mean life or death. Despite the loss of her daughter, Mary Miller was still a fighter. Her research reveals startling gaps in the prison and parole system. Harvey Kavanaugh was only one of thousands of convicts released early from prison, even though the records were riddled with episodes of sexual violence. Now it appeared that Harvey had slipped through the system's cracks again. If Mary could do nothing else for Kathy, she would work to have someone else's child, to save that child. Mary still read the papers, focusing on crime stories. She found the names of other families who had experienced the tragedy of losing a child. Some of them had read of her loss and called her. The first meeting of the embryo group that was to become the Families and Friends of Missing Persons and Violent Crime Victims took place in a West Seattle living room. Sally Peterson was there. Sally's 5-year-old daughter, Heidi, had been kidnapped from the sidewalk in front of the family home. 11 months after Heidi vanished, a heavy snowfall broke down some blackberry bushes in a vacant lot a block from the Peterson home and revealed Heidi's skeleton. Dwayne Holman and Billy Bowman had been the primary investigators on Heidi's case too. And again, they have homed in on a suspect only to be blocked by the lack of evidence, physical evidence. That suspect would evade prosecution for almost a decade. Lola Lindstedt attended her first meeting. Lola's 19-year-old daughter, a new bride, had disappeared from her home on Thanksgiving Eve. Vonnie Stuth's body was discovered buried months later along the creek in back of a farm that had been rented by an escaped sex offender on the run from Michigan. Doreen Hansen attended. Doreen's 13-year-old daughter, Jana, had been murdered by still another parolee. Her killer had committed suicide as he realized the police was closing in on him. Something had to be done. It was as simple as that. And Mary says, I have been to the legislature in Olympia before. Not all of our elected officials were amenable to change, but some of them would listen. We wanted those legislators to know what was happening. We wanted stricter laws on mandatory sentencing and parole. We were asking for someone to consider the victims of crimes and the victims' families. The small group would become the nucleus for a group with growing political clout throughout America, and Mary Miller would, in the fall of 1982, testify before President Reagan's task force on victims' rights as a widely recognized expert on that subject. Quite possibly her work with victims and their families saved her sanity. Such a strong woman, she had never buckled under before at what life have handed her. And she would not give in now, even when the worst possible thing that could happen to a mother had occurred. While Mary restructured her life in Seattle, Harvey Kavanaugh was feeling terribly sorry for himself in Minneapolis. He found a job in construction, but it didn't pay anywhere near what he had made in his own gas station. He stayed with his half-brother until He got a small stake and then found an apartment. And he wrote to Alice, the pleading letters manipulative in word and tone, blaming Alice for deserting him. He wrote of the poignancy of their lives together and told Alice to look at things without seeing the true picture. And he accused her of that. His theme was always that Alice had rejected him and was unwilling to try to get along with him. He reminded her that he had offered to take her back, painted himself as the spouse who was always ready to forgive and forget. Harvey's correspondence was invariably full of the terrible problems that he had dealt with. This poor soul, all alone in Minneapolis, it cost him so much to furnish his apartment. He had been ripped off for double rent. He had, for some reason, had to buy 2 complete new sets of tires for his car. He was making only $7.60 an hour, but he hastened to tell Alice that he was paying into a medical insurance policy so that she and the children would be fully covered. It was another hook into Alice's conscience, although Harvey allowed that he knew the children were already covered by their father's insurance. To add to Harvey's long streak of bad luck, or his assessment of his life that way, he wrote in the fall of 1973 that he had been the victim of a savage attack. He said that he had gone to downtown Minneapolis, where he had been beaten and robbed by 2 white girls, a black girl, and 2 black men. They had used a claw hammer in their attack on him, and Harvey reported that he had been suffered severe injuries, including 4 huge lumps on his head, the near loss of the upper part of his right ear, and the dread possibility that he might lose his right eye. He said that he had no money, no job, and that he didn't know how long it would be before he couldn't even work again. If the assault actually happened, Harvey did not report it to the Minneapolis police. Anyone reading Harvey's letters to his estranged wife without knowing about his background might have mistaken him for a tender-hearted saint. He wrote of watching television, a particular television show with his nieces and nephews, the children's reactions to the sight of a roadrunner killing a sidewinder had sickened him. He had actually become nauseated. He told Alice to see the youngsters laughing and pointing at the snake in his death convulsions. He could not imagine how anyone could so intensely enjoy the sight of killing. He had been driven from the house to a tavern where he consumed beer and chili to calm himself. That he wrote his estranged wife had been a mistake. The beer, the chili, and the clatter of radiators turning on in the dark recesses of his apartment had given him horrible nightmares about murder. He had awakened in a terrible fright. A most sensitive man. Harvey assured Alice that he was absolutely opposed to violence of any kind. He begged her to believe that despite certain occurrences which might seem to indicate otherwise, he had never in his life intentionally hurt anything or anyone. Alice would have liked to believe him. His love letters were getting to her, and she sometimes longed to have him back, and then her doubts crept back in. She was still afraid of him. On Sunday, September 9th, 1973, 13-year-old Jerry Billings of Duluth, Minnesota, was hitchhiking in the northeastern section of Minneapolis. Jerry had run away from home a short time before and moved into an apartment in northeast Minneapolis with a girlfriend and several young men. On September 9th, she was headed to a boyfriend's apartment by the only means of transportation she had, hitchhiking. She had obtained a ride part of the way and held her thumb out again on the corner of Lowry Avenue and Central Avenue NE or Northeast. When a pickup truck with a silver canopy on top slowed down and then stopped and backed up, she ran happily to climb in. The driver was a big man who looked to be between 45 and 50. He smiled at her and told her that he would take her wherever she needed to go. She thought him a strange-looking man. He had such an odd-shaped forehead that ended in a kind of peak on top of his bald head, but he seemed nice enough. He wore green work clothes and heavy work boots. And he said, "My name is Paul. What's yours?" And she gave him a false name. She was on the run and she didn't want anyone to know her real name. She didn't want her mother to find her. Jerry jabbered at the driver, giving him the address of her destination again, and he nodded. But as they drove along, she realized he was going in the wrong direction. He was heading out into the country, away from the city. When she started to protest, the man only grunted and kept on driving. They were going too fast for her to jump out. Before she could say anything else, the man unzipped his trousers and used his free hand to force Jerry's head down toward his penis. She tried to squirm away, but he was terribly strong and he was hurting her neck. In crude terms, he ordered her to perform oral sodomy on him. Nauseated, she complied. After a long time, he let her sit up, and she could see they were way out in the country, racing along a highway. And he commanded, "Take your jeans down." When she had done this, he ordered her to lower her underwear, and then she felt his hand between her legs. He held a claw hammer in his fist, and she was terrified when she realized that the man was pushing the handle of the hammer inside of her, moving it up and down as if it were a male sex organ. And then he growled, "Now give me a blowjob again." And her head was pushed down over his penis again, and his organ was forced into her mouth while he continued to jam the hammer into her vagina. And when she gagged, his fingers closed tightly around the back of her neck. And she felt hopeless. No one could see her from cars passing by. The pickup truck was taking them farther and further into the country, where corn grew 6 feet high on each side of the road. Jerry fought to lift her head and felt a tremendous blow. Her head seemed to explode, and she saw flashing lights. He had hit her with the hammer. She started to cry, and the man told her to shut up. Whimpering, she crouched against the seat. She tried to memorize what the truck cab looked like, although she doubted she would ever get a chance to tell anyone about it. There were 2 bucket seats, and a board rested between them. After they had driven for a long time, the man turned the truck into a cornfield and stopped. And then he said, "Get out." She hesitated, and he picked her up in his arms and carried her into the field, so far that she knew they could not possibly be seen from the country road. The big man dropped her to the ground on her stomach. She could hear him fumbling with his trousers, and then she felt a searing pain. He was attempting to rape her, but it wasn't normal. He was trying to enter her from behind, through her rectum. She screamed and pleaded, and the man finally gave up trying to penetrate her that way. He yanked her by the hair until she was in a kneeling position, and then forced his penis into her mouth again. When he had ejaculated, he pushed her away and told her to get dressed. Jerry Billings had fully expected that the man would kill her, but he allowed her to get dressed, and then he walked her back to his truck. He drove without speaking until they reached Crystal, a small suburban town northwest of Minneapolis, and abruptly he stopped the truck, and he said, "Get out and don't tell anyone, ever." Jerry ran, not looking back, as she heard the truck's motor gun and the tires squeal as the man drove off. Jerry Billings had run away from home. She couldn't go back now, and she couldn't call the police and report what had happened to her, or else they would arrest her. At least that was what she thought would happen. She hid until she was sure the man had gone for good, and told herself that she must never tell. What had happened to her was so awful that she couldn't imagine telling anyone about it anyway, certainly not a male police officer. Her head hurt where he had hit her with the hammer, and she was sick to her stomach from the other, but she wasn't really hurt. She wasn't dead, and she thoroughly expected that she was going to be. Jerry stayed away from home 2 more days, but the memory of what had happened to her was so terrifying that she was so afraid to be on the streets. She went home. She didn't tell her mother about the rape, and her mother told her she was fed up with her running away. Jerry was immediately placed under the jurisdiction of the St. Louis County Juvenile Court as a habitual runaway. She stayed in detention until October 2nd, and then she was admitted to the Red Wing training school. In a way, a circle had been completed. The man who had sodomized Jerry Billings had spent his teen years in a training school. Now his latest victim had been committed to one. The dark-haired youngster didn't tell anyone what had happened to her. She had nightmares and no one understood why, and she seemed afraid of shadows. But no one asked her what was wrong, and she didn't volunteer. She did vow never to hitchhike again. On October 29th, 1973, Jerry could not bear to keep the attack secret any longer. She reported it to the Goodhue County Sheriff's Office in Red Wing, Minnesota. She felt she had to report it. She thought she had seen the man who attacked her at a church service at the state training school. The Red Wing Police Department initiated an investigation along with the Goodhue Sheriff's Office. During this probe, Jerry was given a polygraph examination, which indicated she was telling the truth about her abduction. However, detectives could not develop sufficient probable cause to arrest the man Jerry had seen at the church service. Jerry was able to say only that the man looked like the man who attacked me. In February 1974, the case was turned over to the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office in Minneapolis because the original abduction had occurred in their jurisdiction. That office continued the investigation, but no one was convinced that the man Jerry had seen at the church service was actually the man who had attacked her. With the press of other cases, the attack on Jerry was put on a back burner. Throughout the summer of 1973, Dwayne Holman and Billy Buckman, the detectives, had sought clues that might tie Harvey into Kathy Miller's murder. The probe continued to be frustrating. However, on October 30th, 1973, the man who had given them the role of Black Viskin, the role which proved unmatchable, called again. And he said, "I have found another section of that plastic. When I went to mount my daughter's snow tires, I found there was some plastic in the trunk of her car. It's the same stuff. It's possible that this is the missing link. The plastic I gave Harvey could have been torn off just before I gave some to my daughter." So Detective Holman and Bowman drove at once to the man's home, retrieved the missing section. They took it to the crime lab for comparison with the piece that had been wrapped around Kathy's body when it was found. And Holmes recalls that they played jigsaw puzzle. He said, "We were sure that this was the piece with the edges that would match, but we turned it sideways, upside down, crossways. We spent 4 days in the crime lab trying to find the matching edges. We practically stood on our heads to make that section match. And then we had to admit that it didn't match. It was exactly the same lot of Viskin, just like the other sample had been, but there was a piece missing somewhere." The two detectives were monitoring Harvey's location by checking motor vehicle registration in Minnesota and by talking to Alice Karinan from time to time. She told them about Harvey's letters and phone calls, begging her to come back to him. She had resisted his entreaties so far, but still she had not been able to bring herself to file for divorce. Harvey's address that fall was North Fremont Street in Minneapolis, his brother's home. Harvey Karanen continued to inundate his lost wife with mail. When she did not answer immediately, he was bereft, convinced that the mails had gone astray. He felt his prose was so persuasive that she would surely respond to him if she had read his letters. He told her he was finding it harder day by day to go on without her. When he was not working, the empty days and the lack of money to distract him from thoughts of her were almost more than he could bear. Alice was a little perplexed. Harvey now remembered their marriage as one long honeymoon, filled with love. He blamed her for wasting that love and for turning it into an ugly and grotesque monster causing heartache and pain. She still remembered moments that were not so idyllic. The times he had blacked her eyes and cut her face up with angry blows. When Harvey talked of the loving violence of their passion, she wondered just what he meant. By January 1974, Harvey's love seemed to have grown even stronger. He wrote that he had had no other woman because no other woman could match Alice. He did occasionally visit a restaurant where he nursed a beer and verbally taunted one of the waitresses, who also named Alice. The woman thought him a bit off the wall and asked him why he bothered to sit in her section when he obviously didn't like her. He gave her only an oblique answer. He told her that he just liked to hear people say the name, Alice. Perhaps to pick at some jealousy in Alice, Harvey sometimes wrote about attractive women he encountered. Although he always stressed his fidelity to her, he extolled the beauties of other women, and on one occasion he betrayed his fascination with very young women. He had gone to a bar for some beers and to discuss the Super Bowl with some of the regulars. A wondrously beautiful young girl had come with two young men to shoot pool. And this is what Harvey said. And Harvey was absolutely entranced with her, but he hastened to explain to Alice that it was only because she was such a superb pool player. Harvey Karanen had never been a social animal, and he was becoming more and more isolated and increasingly introspective. During the first cold winter in Minneapolis, he considered himself a loner. It pleased him to sit back and observe others and to realize that he was no superior to them intellectually. He began to play head games with the people he met in bars. They were not friends. He had never had friends. He enjoyed the reaction he got when he stared off into space vacantly in the middle of a conversation. The discomfiture of the other person was fuel for his ego. After he had pulled the vacant stare routine, he would simply walk away. People shook their heads and wondered why the thread of conversation had unraveled. He wrote Alice that he delighted in keeping other people just a shade off balance. They were such fools. The limited mentality of most of the people he met bored him. He had become adept at hiding his contempt for their ignorance. But he was pleased, even conceited, that they obviously found him brilliant. And yet, although he sensed that they admired his intelligence, he also deduced that his companions felt he was not superior in any area that mattered. He knew they laughed at him and found him a rather odd duck. The mind games became a serious game, as war is a game. Despite his protestations of superiority, Harvey admitted to Alice that he was constantly being humiliated by the barbs of the idiots who hung out of the taverns. He considered that he had a satirical sense of humor because he had not a knack for remarks that flew like arrows to his target's weakest spots. He had mistaken satirical for sadistic. He bragged that he had hurt some people badly with his unerring aim for cutting words. And of course, their dislike for him increased with each new insult. The responses to him humiliated me more, he says. And so he responded with more taunts. Although Harvey Carrinan purported to want friends and acceptance, he actually preferred the rush that came when he teased people. The overweight women, the old men, the insecure divorcees, and the others who came to the tavern to lose themselves in a blur of alcohol, to any warmth of friendship. He claimed in his letters to Alice that he wished he could change places with those he ridiculed, even the dullest clods, but that he could not take life's humiliation without erupting into anger. He could not forgive, nor could he forget what had been done to him in his life. He could not accept a gentle jest without returning it with a verbal punch to the gut. Harvey's introspection is interesting to contemplate. He could apparently search his personality and bring out certain truths, but then his perception became flawed. His rage took over and left no room at all for the feelings of others. It had always been that way. The world was against him. He deserved attention and love. No one else did. Harvey was not stupid. He was clever, verbal, literate, and deviously manipulative. He could weave words into traps, manufacture false truths from whole cloth, and then cover his tracks until they might never have crushed the earth beneath his feet. Time and time again, Harvey wrote of one of the constant needs in his life, a passion for certainty. He said, "I have an unhappy passion for certainty. I must be doubly and triply sure of everything." A passion for certainty, an odd and ambiguous term. He needed to be certain that Alice still loved him and would one day return. He needed to know that all aspects of his life were well organized, all of his secret thoughts and deeds pigeonholed where only he could retrieve them. And so he kept records, notations that meant something special to him, on papers, hidden in odd places, records in his head. Death might be considered the ultimate certainty, unchanging and unchangeable. Had Harvey satisfied his passion for certainty by stopping the lives of females who did not haunt him? Even though Harvey's letters and phone calls had been masterpieces of manipulation, Alice had not responded as he expected she would. He had written her that her son needed him as a father, completely overlooking the beatings he had ministered to the boy. He had painted a glowing picture of what their lives would be like, but Alice was dragging her feet. She answered his letters, sending one back for 10 of his, but she could not come to him. It occurred to him that Alice might possibly be holding back because of the occasional beating he had given her. Harvey spelled out the terms that would prevent any further rough stuff. All Alice had to remember was that he would never hit her again, unless she should go to bed with another man while she was still legally married to him. He allowed that. Even then, he might not hit her. He might not. He accused Alice of seeing dragons that don't exist, explaining that he was actually a good person if only given the chance. Other people were telling Alice lies and distorted truth about him, he argued, and he begged her to try to understand the meaning of the words in the proper context. "Alice, I'm the same person now as I was then. I have not changed a bit." And he had not changed, not a bit. Although Harvey had pledged his undying love over and over again to Alice, and warned her of what might have happened if she were unfaithful to him, he met another woman in January 1974, a woman to whom he was strongly attracted. Harvey was on his way home late on the bitterly cold evening when a car ahead of him stalled. He saw that there were 3 women in it. He pulled his truck up behind them and approached the driver. One of the women was, in Harvey's words, a little old lady, but the other 2 were younger, and the youngest was very pretty. Harvey offered his assistance. The ladies in distress happened to be Jehovah's Witnesses out there doing God's work. The temperature that January night was 24 degrees below zero and still dropping, and there were no service stations in sight. The 3 women considered Harvey's offer a beneficence from God himself. He explained that they had apparently broken the universal joint on their car and that it was something that could be fixed there on the street. When he graciously offered to give them a lift home, they accepted. It was a long trip. The women lived in Anoka, a suburb some distance away, and Harvey chatted with his passengers. He judged 2 of them to be idiotic and fanatical, but he maintained his chivalrous attitude. By an odd coincidence, one of the women had lived in Seattle for a time and had known Alice when she was married to her first husband. All of the women thought Harvey charming and thanked him profusely when he delivered them safely to their homes. Harvey wrote to Alice about the incident, using it to show that he was indeed a pretty nice guy. He stressed that he had found all the stranded women boring and that their religious fervor had turned him off. In truth, however, one of the religious fanatics did appeal to him. Her name was Aileen Huntley. She was 28 years old, but appeared to be much younger, and Harvey would follow up on his interest in her within weeks. But first he had to try one more time to win Alice back. He put Aileen in the back part of his mind, should he find himself alone without a woman to love and comfort him. Aileen might just fill the bill. In February 1974, Harvey decided that he would have to confront Alice in person to win her back. On February 27, Holman and Buckman were notified that Harvey's car had been seen back in Seattle at 180th and 15th Northeast. They notified the tax squad immediately, and word came back that Harvey had been arrested on the 3rd-degree assault warrant filed by Alice because of her split lip and blackened eyes. He was brought into the station, and Holman and Buckman questioned him. Face to face again after 8 months, all 3 men were tense. And Bowman said slowly, "Harvey, you're in here because of the charges filed by your wife, but you are still our main suspect in Kathy Miller's death. We're not going to rest until it's solved, one way or another." And Harvey glared at them. He said, "From the first, I have felt you have picked on me, zero in on me. However, after the 20th hand reports that I have received, I have to say you were doing a good job." He relaxed and smiled. They studied him and took his remarks to mean that whatever circumstantial evidence they had come up with, he knew they couldn't prove anything against him. He was almost enjoying the standoff. Harvey still refused to take a lie detector's test. Holman said, "If you take the polygraph and pass it, we'll certainly go in another direction. Until that time, you are a suspect, and you were the last person we think to see Kathy alive." Harvey began to sweat, and his features began to twitch, the way they always had when the detectives probed too closely. Harvey took another tack. He asked the detectives to think about their families, their wives and children, and try to understand his position, that of a man who only wanted what they had, a loving wife and children. And then Harvey smiled triumphantly and played his ace. He said, I got back in the city yesterday and I went directly to Alice. We made love. She's not going to press the charges against me on the assault. They had almost expected it. Alice vacillated constantly when it came to Harvey. And Detective Bowman said, we're still going to fingerprint you, photograph you, and process you through this jail. And he said, be my guest. Jean-Baptiste, the fingerprint technician, reported later, however, that Harvey would not sign the fingerprint card. He thought I took too many, especially his palm prints, just for a third-degree assault case. Harvey didn't look good. He had lost considerable weight and he seemed on the fine edge of exhaustion. Still, he had regained his bravado. He figured he had beaten the detectives he hated so much and gave him confidence. Karen bragged, I'm an old-timer. I have spent 27 years inside the walls and I'm never going back. Just as Harvey had predicted, Alice came in to say that she was dropping the assault charges against him. Her daughter Georgia had accompanied her to the homicide offices, and she broke down in tears when she heard that her mother had backed down and she was seriously considering going back to Minnesota with him. The girl was sobbing, and she said, I'm afraid for her. I don't want her to go back there with him. But there's nothing I can do about it because she would not listen to me. Thank you for listening to The Murder Book. Have a great week. Thanks again for tuning into The Murder Book, a true crime podcast. You can find all episodes of The Murder Book for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podchaser, Amazon Music. You can go to my website, themurderbooktruecrimepodcast.com. All resources used in researching this episode, including books and newspaper articles, are on my website. We are on Facebook and on Twitter at themurderbook1. Send your comments or suggestions at my email, themurderbook5@gmail.com. Please subscribe and leave a 5-star rating so that others can find this podcast and it helps me get better. Episodes come out every Monday, and there's a Spanish version for these episodes. Enjoy your week.